Hello.
Hi, Paul.
There, I guess it works. I was having a bit of trouble getting on.
Oh, no worries. I'm glad it's working okay, and it's good to meet you. I can say that I'm halfway through your book and enjoying it quite thoroughly. It's really great to meet you and to learn about the history, which is really profound. So, very happy to talk with you this hour and learn more about your journey. I really enjoyed hearing about your early background in Canada because actually I grew up on Cape Cod, not too far away from Eastern Canada. And I must say that you were very courageous even at an early age in terms of really working for rights for animals. And perhaps it would be helpful to start there to understand a little bit about your journey and what's led you to the present. It sounds like ever since you were in your early teens and 20s that you were really striving to address the rights of let's say the 8 million species who can't vote on the planet. And I'd like to get your thoughts on your earliest experiences with that.
Well, when I was 10 years old, I was a member of the Kindness Club, which was set up by Ida Fleming, and she was actually at the time the wife of the Premier of New Brunswick, a conservative Premier of New Brunswick, actually. Anyway, she set up the Kindness Club. The honorary president of that was Albert Schweitzer. And, she sent out educational material about being kind to animals. And my mother got very much involved in that and, was very inspirational in herself. So it was really when I was 10 years old that there was an experience that changed my life because I spent the summer swimming with a family of beavers, and particularly one little beaver, and had a great time. And so next summer when I went back, I couldn't find them and found out trappers had killed them all during the winter. So that made me quite angry. So that winter I began to walk the trap lines and free the animals and destroy the traps. So that was, I think I'm still doing the same thing now, 60 years later.
That's incredible. Well, what an early. How old were you at the time with the beavers?
And when I started doing the trap, sabotaging traps, I was 11.
That's amazing. You're reminding me of one of my early experiences when I was 4 or 5 years old. My grandfather took me fishing in Southern California, and I was pretty excited. And he caught a fish. He brought it on shore, and I ended up seeing it. And I was really excited to be close to the fish. And then I asked for him to put the fish back because I didn't want to hurt the fish. And he wouldn't. He kept the fish, and I was pretty upset about it. And so even at the age of 4 or 5, I really felt strongly that I wanted that fish to live. It was nice to be close to the fish and to see the fish, but I really didn't feel a need to catch the fish. It was hard to deal with at a tender age.
I think most children have an affinity for animals, and we sort of force it out of them through socialization, education. I had a similar experience with my father, who was completely opposite to my mother. And we were out there. He was catching fish. I was telling him to put it back. Actually, I ended up throwing some of them back. Got in trouble for it. But one of the things that really bothered me is that he caught about 60 trout, and he just kept throwing them on the bank. And then when he was finished, he took about 8 of them and then just left the rest there. And because of course at the time fish were probably more abundant than they are now, but still, it was incredible waste. And I still remember him just leaving those fish on. And my protests were met with being slapped. So those were very profound experiences that had a lot of impact on my development as a child.
You're reminding me of one of Gandhi's sayings, which is that the planet has enough for every man's need, but not a single man's greed.
That's very true.
And yeah, these are profound examples. Some years later, I had the chance to visit Faroe Islands and spent a little time there and got to know the culture, and also Iceland. And I was wondering if you could describe briefly your experience dealing with the controversial practice at the time of whaling And I believe it was either Iceland or the Faroe Islands. Perhaps you could tell me a little bit about that experience.
Well, we're still very much involved with this. Last summer, we went to intervene against Icelandic whaling and also the killing of pilot whales in the Faroe Islands. In the Faroe Islands, I began opposition to that in 1983. And we've made a lot of progress, I think, because in 1983, I would say 100% of the population of the Faroe Islands was pro killing pilot whales. And now it's about 50%. So that's a lot of progress. It is probably one of the most barbaric and actually unexplainable things that are being done today. I mean, they don't kill these pilot whales for money. They don't really need them for food. In fact, they're not even allowed to eat more than 250 grams a month because of the high methyl mercury content in them. It's done for fun. And the Faroe Islands has one of the highest per capita incomes anywhere in Europe. And what they're doing is illegal under European law and Danish law, but they have an exemption because they're a territory of Denmark. Although they enjoy all the benefits of the EU, they don't have to abide by the regulations of the EU. So this last summer, just a few weeks ago, actually, I went there, and as I approached with our ship, the Faroese passed a law restricting us from entering the 12-mile limit, which we respected. I stayed outside of the 12-mile limit until on July 9th, where I was notified of a grind or the driving of the pilot whales towards the beaches. And so I just ignored the restriction and went in and was immediately pursued by the Faroese Coast Guard. Unfortunately, it was a race against time and distance because we were 2.5 hours away. So by the time we arrived, they had just finished the killing, but we were able to document the blood on the water and the corpses on the shore. And then we retreated back beyond the 12-mile limit. And then on the 19th, another grind was about to be called. So I once again violated their so-called restricted area and was pursued by two Coast Guard vessels. This time we were able to prevent the killing of the grind, the killing of the pilot whales. The result was that Denmark forced Jamaica to remove our flag, and we were then brought into court, although we were never given a summons and we didn't appear in court. But the court then ruled that I was to be fined $23,000 US, and every crew member was to be fined $600 for immigration violations, although nobody actually set foot on the Faroe Islands. So we're appealing that, but I don't have any intention of paying their fines. But our objective here is just to continually embarrass the Faroese for what they're doing before the world, and we've actually got that out all over the world as what they're doing. And also we're now in the process of boycotting tourism to the Faroe Islands, and also Faroese farm-raised salmon, which not many people realize that the salmon raised in the Faroe Islands actually swim through the blood of slaughtered pilot whales, and also the corpses of the pilot whales are dumped in the ocean. They're not fully utilized; they're dumped in the ocean, and that is right in the vicinity where the salmon farms are. So it's a long process. You don't make these changes overnight, and we will continue to do what we're doing. And a lot of people say, well, what have it still goes on. Yes, but slavery wasn't abolished overnight. It takes time.
That makes sense. I was amazed to hear about your bravery in actually offering to have the court cases, for example, perhaps in Iceland, where I think you probably were active in getting some whaling shut down there, and then offered to come to Iceland to have a court case. Could you tell me more about that experience?
Well, in 1985, I brought my ship to Reykjavik, and we didn't do anything. We just said that the International Whaling Commission regulations take effect in 1986, and if you kill whales, we'll return and we will sink your ships. 1986 arrived. They continued to kill whales. So in November of 86, we sank two of their whaling ships dockside in Reykjavik. And that ended up shutting them down for a number of years. We also destroyed the whale processing plant there. So nobody was arrested. There wasn't any, summons or anything put out. And I kept writing to them saying, well, is there a crime and what are the charges? I didn't get any answer. So in January of 88, I flew to Reykjavik and demanded to be arrested. I was met by police officers at the airport, and the chief immigration officer said, how long do you intend to stay in Iceland? And I said, I don't know, 5 minutes, 5 years, you tell me. And then we went off to interrogation, and they say, "Are you admitting to sinking these ships?" I said, "Yeah, we'll sink the other two at the first opportunity." Well, the next morning, without any explanation, they just drove me to the airport, put me on a plane, and sent me back to New York. And the Minister of Justice said in the Althing, or the Parliament, that day, he says, "Who the hell does he think he is? He comes into our country and demands to be arrested. Get him out of here." Because they knew that to put me on trial would be to put themselves on trial. And, I announced that we're going to intervene in 2007. Upon arrival, they shut it down. In 2019, they were going to go whaling. Upon arrival, they shut it down. And a few months ago, just hours after our arrival in Icelandic waters, the Minister for Agriculture and Fisheries shut it down until the end of August. So we're making a lot of progress there. And again, more than 50% of the Icelanders are now against the killing of whales. The only reason whaling continues is because of one man, Christian Lawson, who's 80 years old, but he's sort of a modern day Captain Ahab. He just wants to kill whales. He's one of the wealthiest men in Iceland, has a great deal of influence. So he's now attempting to actually threatening to take down the government because of the decision to ban whaling until the end of August. And he's demanding a 4-year permit to continue to kill whales. So we'll probably be returning again if he resumes. So I think the Minister of Fisheries and Agriculture was very courageous in making that decision to end whaling temporarily, but still, it was a brave decision on her part, and she hasn't backed down. But there's just no reason for it to continue. The only market for it is Japan, and he sends a shipload every year or so to Japan. Icelanders don't really eat whale meat, but where the people who do, you serve it in restaurants along with puff and other animals, are the tourists, European and American tourists who, want to come, and I think it gives them a thrill to eat something that they're not allowed to eat in their own countries.
It seems rather bizarre, reminding me of things like fox hunts in Scotland, which I guess are happen to this day. But can you tell us a little bit about your experience with such historic practices, I would say?
I was involved. I joined the hunt saboteurs for disruption of a fox hunt in Scotland. It's easy in Scotland because there's no trespassing laws there, so you can actually follow them through all the properties of the farmers or whatever. Anyway, we spent the entire day disrupting and chasing these guys, and it was somewhat successful. But I thought it was very frustrating because they all had horses and were trudging by on foot, and the hunt supporters had cars. But at the end of the day, it was in a place called Houston in Scotland, and there was only one pub. At the end of the day, we decided to go to that pub, and the landlord at the pub didn't want us in there. He was trying to kick us out. But then the hunt master came over, and he said, "What's going on here?" And the landlord said, "These hooligans, they're not gonna have a drink here." And the hunt master said, "Oh, come on, my good man." He says, "We might be enemies during the day, but at night we can be civilized." And then he then he bought us all drinks. So it was rather bizarre.
Well, it's quite a combination, and perhaps some form of chivalry. But anyway, that's interesting. The pilot whale experience reminds me of an experience I had in faraway Baja, California. I managed to be freediving or snorkeling when a large pod of pilot whales came by, and I had a video camera, and I could just barely make out their silhouettes, but it was amazing to see more than 100 pilot whales go by with their babies and calves and everything, just some 10 meters away, just to witness them swim past me and to experience such size and grace in close proximity. And I think to experience such an amazing group of living creatures close hand, I think it certainly transformed my experience with them. But I can imagine how important it would be to ensure that we can keep these major species and ecosystems alive so that they can regenerate.
In the Faroes, anytime a pilot whale pod is spotted, they immediately go out to try and drive it to shore to kill it. There's 23 killing beaches that they try to do this. The last one that we intervened against was on the beach in Tórshavn, the capital, and there happened to be a cruise ship there, the Ambition, from the Ambassador line. And the filming was all done in sight of hundreds and hundreds of people on the cruise ship, which actually the cruise ship line then condemned it as barbaric and said they were pretty outraged by the whole thing. But what they do is they drive entire families, entire pods, kill every one of them. It doesn't matter what the, calves or whatever. They even rip the fetuses out of the mothers and, stand there proudly holding the fetuses like there's some sort of trophy. It's incredibly barbaric, and I just don't understand the mentality behind it. But as they say, there's children there. Children watch it. Children participate. So when you're introduced to this as a child, I guess it sort of desensitizes you and allows you to grow up to be one of these monsters that these men have become. And people say, well, they're very friendly people, and everything. Yeah, well, Ted Bundy was very friendly. I actually had a friend who worked with Ted Bundy, and I said, "What was he like?" He said, "He was very friendly." He said, "I would have went out with him if he had have asked me." So you can't, psychopathic behavior cannot be seen on the surface.
That makes a lot of sense. I read with interest experience with longline fishing, and I had a chance to visit some longline fishermen in Hawaii who were truly hunters. I mean, I get the feeling that they were very much exploiting or extracting from the environment as much as they could. But could you tell us a little bit about your experience with the longline fishing industry in the Pacific Ocean?
Well, long lines can be up to 100 miles long, just like drift nets or gill nets. The real problem is highly industrialized, mechanized fishing operations, which are just basically strip mining life out of the ocean. The seafood industry would like to say, well, to depict it as small boats with a small group of men who are out there working in very rough conditions, and to provide food for their families and everything. But the reality is giant factory ships and just pulling everything out of the ocean. The super trawlers off the coast of Europe, the Dutch super trawlers, take one net is about the size of 3 school buses, full of fish. Last year, we were able to document 150,000 blue whiting that was just dumped and floating on the surface because it was the not target fish. The bycatch of this industry is just absolutely incredible. But we're not opposed to fishing by, if you go out off the coast of Nigeria or off of the Philippines in a small boat and catch fish for your family, that's not the problem. The problem are the big factory ships. Take one fish, for instance, as a good example, is Antarctic Patagonia toothfish, which are marketed under the name of Chilean sea bass. They're not from Chile, they're not even a bass, but it's a good marketing name. And these are caught from deep down in the Southern Ocean. So when we intercepted the toothfish poacher, the Thunder, it ran and dropped its net. We pulled up that net. That net was 2 kilometers deep. When we pulled it up, it was 72 kilometers long and weighed 76 tons on total. And that was just one net from one ship. And now when they catch this toothfish, then they load it on, freeze it, load it on planes, send it to New York or Paris or London, to the most expensive restaurants because it's that much in demand. You can't call that a sustainable fishery. There's no way you can do that. And this is the problem. For instance, in the 1990s, there was a fish called the orange roughy, and it was caught off in New Zealand. It was in every supermarket and everything. You could find it quite easily. You don't see it anymore because where a salmon takes 4 years to become sexually mature and dies, orange roughy takes 45 years to become sexually mature and lives 200 years. It cannot keep up with the demand that the industry puts on them. And so we've seen the collapse of the northern cod fishery, the collapse of the bluefin tuna fishery, and this is happening more and more. And as they collapse, we simply move on to another species. It's an adaptation to diminishment, and we forget about the other species. I was raised in an East Coast fishing village in Canada, and I've seen that diminishment. Turbot, for example, that was called in the 50s, 60s, that was called a garbage fish. Nobody ate it. And if it was caught, they threw it back. That is a fish you'll get in a New York restaurant now because we've adapted to that diminishment. You don't see the cod anymore, very rarely, and so northern cod, that is. And so it's this constant adaptation to diminishment, which is causing destruction in the ocean. And with the diminishment of the fishes, with diminishment of whales and dolphins, that leads to the diminishment of phytoplankton, because phytoplankton require nutrients like iron and nitrogen and magnesium and others. And they get that from the feces of whales and seabirds and that. And that's why since 1950, there's been a 40% diminishment in phytoplankton. And what does that mean? Phytoplankton provides 70% of the oxygen in the air we breathe and sequesters enormous amounts of CO2. And the reality is, if phytoplankton disappears from the sea, we die. We don't live in a world without phytoplankton. We need it. But for the most part, people are completely unaware of it. And that figure of 40% diminishment can be verified through a 2010 article in Scientific America, which actually I haven't seen anything since, but that was the last one that documented that diminishment.
Yeah, there's actually been several peer-reviewed articles. One of them tracked the level of phytoplankton from 1899 to 2010. And during the early decades, it was using Secchi discs, which are these white and black discs they would lower from ships, and to determine how good the visibility was. And that's an indirect measure of the plankton. And then later they used integrated satellite imagery as well. But I've seen estimates in the subtropical oceans of 30 to 40% decreases in productivity, which was very substantial. And so I think
Yeah,
it's
we just have to compare it to the destruction of forests because that's what phytoplankton is. It's aquatic forests, and we're just clear cutting those forests.
yeah, no, that's huge. And I think there is a shifting baseline. I grew up on Cape Cod, and apparently in the 1700s and 1800s, every able-bodied seaman was out there fishing codfish. And yet, when I grew up there in the 60s and 70s, I never saw a codfish. And I think the cod fishery migrated north from Cape Cod to Canada to probably Greenland and Iceland, and conversely from England to Scotland to the Faroe Islands to Iceland. And when I was in Iceland a decade or two ago, I think they were hunting the codfish, and there was a Boeing jet twice a week departing northwestern fjords of Iceland to deliver codfish for fish and chips in the UK. But it seems like we're just chasing it further and further north to the point of no return.
Well, it's already collapsed. During the 80s, I kept saying, writing and warning that the cod fishery would collapse. I had debates on television with government scientists, and I remember them saying, "You don't know anything about this, Watson. We have the best scientists in the world. We have the best computer models in the world. You're wrong, sir. You're absolutely wrong." And it collapsed in 1992. It's never recovered. And it collapsed because they decided to go instead. The cod fishery off of Newfoundland existed for hundreds of years by these small boats going out and and catching fish. And then in the 80s, they put these giant draggers in to just literally scour the area. And that's what wiped it out. And in 92, the Canadian government said, that's okay, we'll give it a 5-year moratorium and it'll come back. 5 years later, it didn't come back. Oh, okay, that's okay. We'll do another 5 year. There's still moratoriums, and it's not going to come back. That's the problem. And the ignorance, I'll call the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans the Department of Fishy Business, basically. It's the most incompetent bureaucracy in the Canadian government. Because of it, the cod fishery collapsed, the salmon industry is collapsing. They've mismanaged everything, but they insist they've done the right thing. Again, during the 80s, I was debating a DFO scientist, and I predicted that there would be a collapse in the salmon runs on the Fraser River. And this guy said, I said, they're going to collapse in 3 years. And he said, you don't know what you're talking about and everything. You're wrong, sir. And I said, I was wrong. It took 2 years. So I have a word for the scientists who work for the governments, like the Canadian Department of Fisheries. I call them biostitutes. They have to find the science to justify the political decisions that are being made. And those political decisions are being made because of economic pressure from corporations.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Were these bottom trawlers that were used to take out the codfish in eastern Canada?
Yeah, bottom trawlers, midwater trawlers, and midwater trawlers. Yeah, there was. But when you invest $100 million for a ship, that means you got to collect an awful lot of fish to pay off the mortgage on that vessel, and so it's a vicious circle. The fewer the fish, the bigger the ship, and the more intense the machinery to extract those fish, which means that you have to make more money to pay for that and to upgrade all the time. I mean, it's just obscene the size of these ships and the devastation that they cause.
I'm amazed at the scale of the toothfish net, 2 kilometers deep and 70 kilometers long. How much bycatch occurs as a result of nets of such dimensions?
We didn't find a lot of bycatch on the toothfish because they're set down so very, very deep. But the
Okay.
bycatch on in other areas is, like for instance, the shrimp industry. For every kilo of shrimp, 22 kilos of something else has been killed. So the bycatch that off the coast of France from the trawlers is thousands of dolphins every year, and that was actually a victory we got this year as the we managed to get to the French government to ban the trawlers that were killing the dolphins. And of course, that has resulted in a lot of anger and death threats from the fishing industry. But you know, those are the things you have to face when you're dealing with that. But it
Yeah.
took a long. How we did that is how do we got to get people aware of that. And so when Lamia Samlami is the president of Sea Shepherd France, and she was saying to me, you know, people, it's out of sight, it's out of mind. People don't know what's going on. The corpses wash up on the beach of Brittany or Normandy, and what do you do? And what I told her is I said, take those bodies, take those corpses to the Eiffel Tower, take them to the National Assembly, take them to the European Parliament, and put them on the steps. And that's what they did, and that got everybody's attention on it. Of course, they tried to arrest us because it's illegal to touch a dead dolphin on the beach, apparently, and that. But anyway, they dropped the charges because there's the publicity. Publicity is always the best thing. You can get publicity on something like that, then that's your best weapon. I've always said that the most powerful weapon on the planet is the camera, and if you don't catch it on camera, it's not there. It didn't happen.
That's amazing. That makes so much sense. Could you tell me about your co-founding of Greenpeace and how that occurred?
Yeah, actually, in 1969, I attended a demonstration of the Canadian-U.S. border on Washington and British Columbia, and it was a demonstration against the nuclear testing in Amchitka Island, and it was sponsored by the Sierra Club and the Quakers. And those two groups got together. I was a member of the Sierra Club at the time, and the two groups got together, and we set up a group called the Don't Make a Wave Committee. And that was because people still remember the tsunami that hit Vancouver Island from the 1964 Anchorage earthquake. And so we called it the Don't Make a Wave Committee. Now, at one of the early meetings, somebody left the meeting and flashed a peace sign, and it was Bill Darnell, who was one of the early members, and he said, "Make it a Greenpeace." And Bob Hunter said, "Hey, great name for the ship." So we called the first boat that we got, with this 85-foot halibut boat that we got, we called it the Greenpeace. And the boat that I sailed on was the Greenpeace 2. And so those two boats went up to Amchitka. The Greenpeace 1 came back because they delayed the test. The Greenpeace 2, which was I was on, went up. And they then brought the test forward just before we arrived so that we wouldn't be there when it arrived. So we were a few hundred miles away when they detonated the test. So that was the origin and we got the name Foundation from Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy. So that was the Greenpeace Foundation. And it was incorporated, and the name changed from Don't Make a Wave Committee to the Greenpeace Foundation in 1972. So I was one of the 12 early directors of Greenpeace. Bob Hunter was the president, and I have to say, if it wasn't for Bob Hunter, nobody would even know what Greenpeace is today. He was, you know, really the brains behind the whole thing, and also all the early people were journalists or writers or people involved in television. Ben Metcalf was with CBC. Hunter worked for the Vancouver Sun. And so it was really the first environmental group to be controlled by media people, people who understood how the media works. And because there's only three laws of media, I mean, four elements of media. And those four elements are simply sex, scandal, violence, and celebrity. And if you don't have one of those elements in a story, you don't have a story. So you have to get this drama. You have to create this drama. So Bob Hunter was one of the first gonzo journalists, which is you don't just report the story, you actually create the story. And so that's what he was doing at the time. And to give you an example of those four elements, in 1984, I led a campaign to stop the killing of wolves up in northern British Columbia and the Yukon. And we had violence of them threatening to kill well, they were killing wolves from helicopters and threatening to kill us if we were intervening. So that we got the violence down. And then we got the Minister of the Environment taking bribes from the big game hunting organization. So we got the scandal down. And so I recruited Bo Derek as a spokesperson for this. And I mean, I remember at that press conference, a reporter for the Vancouver Sun said, "Come on, what does Bo Derek know about wolves? This is ridiculous that she's the spokesperson." And I said, well, that's not the point, is it? If I had the best wolf biologists in the world here, it'd be an empty room. Nobody'd be here to recover it. But I see the place is full of reporters. And this is going to be a story on the front page of your newspaper tomorrow. You're going to write it, and your editor's going to put it there. And there's not a damn thing you can do about it, is there? And that's exactly where it was. So, those are the elements. If you control the elements, you control the story. I learned that because in 1977, we took Bridget Bardot to the ice floes off of Newfoundland to protect the baby seals. That gave us the cover of almost every single major magazine in the world. So it's celebrity and sex. That was what got it there. Bardot posing cheek to cheek with a baby seal, cover of Perry Matt, Bunta, whatever, Stern.
That's an incredible achievement. And yet, when you got back to Greenpeace headquarters, how were you received after that?
On the 77 campaign, what happened is this is more political than anything else. Patrick Moore was wanting to be president of Greenpeace, and Bob Hunter was leaving, and I was the only threat to him being. I didn't want to be president of Greenpeace, but I was a threat to him on that. But during this SEAL campaign, he came along. I didn't want him along, but he came along. But at one point, he wanted to get into the helicopter with Bridget Bardot to go to the ice. And I said, no, you're not a cameraman and you're not a photographer. I need them in there. And he said, well, let me put it this way. When I become president of Greenpeace, you're out the door. And I said, yeah, well, let me put it this way. You're not getting into the helicopter. And a few months later, I was brought before the board, even though I was a board member, and the vote was to dismiss me. And the reason for dismissal was theft and vandalism, because during the campaign, I walked up to a sealer who was about to kill a baby seal, and I grabbed the club from his hand, threw it in the water. You stole that man's property and you destroyed it. And I said, and I saved the seal. And that was what I was there for. And if I have to do it again, I'll do it again. And they said, well, this is a complete violation of our bearing witness philosophy, which is a Quaker thing. And I said, well, I don't adhere to that. You don't walk down the street and see a woman being raped and do nothing but take pictures. And you don't walk down the street and see a kitten being stomped to death and hang a banner. I'm there to save them. I'm not there to document them or to bear witness. I dismiss this bear witness thing. And they said, well, that's what Greenpeace's foundation is based on, bearing witness. I said, okay, well, so I set up the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society with a strategy which I called aggressive nonviolence. We're not going to hurt anybody, but we're going to aggressively intervene. And 45 years later, I've never caused an injury to a single person.
Mm-hmm. No, that's huge. And I think there is this dichotomy. I noticed that in a lot of the basic sciences, there's an emphasis on observation as opposed to action. And I wonder, after 30 years of prevarication from the Rio, Jacques Cousteau, meeting with 170 leaders saying, do not let scientific uncertainty be a cause for inaction. Yet here we are 30 years later, and we're seeing emissions higher than ever, threats to wildlife and ecosystems greater than ever. How do we justify inaction in a world of a collapsing ecosystem?
Well, climate change has been co-opted by major corporations. Last year's climate change conference was sponsored by Coca-Cola. This year's conference is going to be sponsored by the oil industry in the Emirates. And I noticed last year's, you couldn't get through all of the barricades to even attend the conference unless you were, well, first of all, you couldn't actually be an activist to do it. Right now, they're actually in Europe, they're passing all kinds of draconian laws to prevent activists from doing anything before they even get to do anything. And so they're basically declaring war on climate change activists. The attitude of governments is this: endure and die and don't ask questions. That's, there will not be any change through government. It's not going to happen. Governments are owned. They've purchased and they're owned by the oil companies and the media corporations, which are turned by those energy corporations. And that, so, it's become increasingly more difficult to get to resist. The things that we did in the 60s and the 70s, even the early 80s, can't do them now. In my case is a good example. I'm on the Interpol red notice list on the charge of conspiracy to trespass on a whaling ship which is operating illegally in the Southern Ocean, or was. And nobody gets put on there for trespassing. The red notice is for serial killers, war criminals, major drug traffickers. I'm the only person in the history of the red notice to be put on there for conspiracy to trespass. But Japan's a powerful country, and what they want, what they get. And I've had lawyers look into it with the Interpol, and they agree. Interpol actually agrees with that I shouldn't be there. But they said, but again, Japan is the one who makes the decision of whether you're there or not. So Interpol is being used even more and more, and it's being used abusively to punish people for political problems, not for criminal problems. But soon it will be any opposition to towards what's happening with climate change will soon be a crime. It'll be a crime to even think probably about opposing the oil companies and the energy content companies, or to oppose war, of course. I mean, war is the biggest perversion in human history. It's a total, it makes absolutely no sense at all. It's the ultimate manifestation of the insanity of humanity. And yet, people still buy into it.
By some estimates, deepest application of the precautionary principle would be, why would we allow our civilization to embark further upon climate disruption when it's completely unknown territory and threatening the lives of our children and the livelihoods? And yet when efforts are made to actually draw down carbon with nature-based ecosystems, those are criticized and in some cases made illegal. It's just astounding to me that that we have this dichotomy where it's perfectly legal to disrupt the climate by spewing more carbon dioxide into the air, into our atmosphere, and yet it's made limited and sometimes illegal to actually draw down carbon dioxide. I'm just astonished at this construction in our civilization, and I wonder how could it possibly be sustainable.
I think because the consequences of climate change are not our problem. It's future generations' problems, but I think they've miscalculated and it's going a lot faster than they thought. I was debating a Japanese whaler and part of the Japanese whaling industry, and I said, "What about your children and your children's children?" And he said, "That's not my problem. That's their problem." He actually said that to me. And I actually said to an Alaska fisherman, I said, "If for no other reason, save the fishery for your children and their children's children." And he actually said to me, "In 5 years, my mortgage is to be paid, and after that, I don't give a shit." Why do people like that have children? Well, it's because it's what you do. It's what's expected of you. But I don't think they really give any thought to it. And that's why so many children are being brought into the world and are unloved and uneducated and undernourished, because we don't really, as a species, really give a shit. It really comes down to that. I mean, we're much more concerned with, celebrities and amusing ourselves with video games than we are of reality. And that's become more and more of a problem. I'm 72 years old. I'm happy. I lived through probably the most materially wealthy and freest generations in the history of the planet. It'll never come again. We don't have the resources to do that all over again. And the freedoms are being taken away more and more and more. 1983, I blockaded St. John's Harbor in Newfoundland, and I kept that sealing fleet from coming out for 10 days. And when they threatened to come out after me, I said, "Okay, I'll just sink the ship right here in the mouth and that'll block the harbor." And they backed off. I can't imagine doing that today. They would blow me out of the water and without any hesitation.
That's
But
amazing.
and then what they've done is they come up with these Orwellian laws, which, for instance, in Canada, it's called the Seal Protection Act. Under the Seal Protection Act, it's illegal to witness a seal being killed, to document it, photograph it, or approach a seal where a seal is being killed. And that's called the Seal Protection Act. And so it's really the Sealing Industry Protection Act, but that's how they just name these things. So it makes it look like we're the ones that are violating the Seal Protection Act. A couple of years ago, when we stopped them from killing a pod of pilot whales, no, excuse me, a pod of dolphins in the Faroe Islands, our boat, or the little crew in the small boat, were arrested and charged with cruelty to animals. And the reasoning behind that was we caused undue stress to the dolphins that were being driven towards the beach to be killed. We caused them undue stress. And our argument was, well, what about the whalers? They're chasing them. And the argument to that was they're exempt. So, there's these laws are passed and then exemptions are made for the people who are really committing the crimes.
That's astounding. You're reminding me that this legislation, like the American Invents Act, was the act that actually took inventorship away from first to invent to first to file, which to conform with international regulations, but also suddenly it favors large corporations. So it's really amazing how so many of these legislations actually eviscerate the thing that they're aiming to uphold.
Well, what happened to me last year is exactly that. My organization, the movement that I created, was taken over by this property developer from Florida who covertly registered the trademark for the name and the logos I designed in 75 different countries, cost them about $400,000 to do it. And then we suddenly became aware that this guy owned everything. And so I was then brought before the board and told that they were going to make these significant changes. We're no longer going to be doing anything controversial or confrontational. We're going to work with governments. We're going to work with corporations. And I said, no, I can't support that. I was offered $300,000 a year to be a figurehead for my organization as long as I didn't say anything, post anything, or write anything. And I said, no, I can't accept that. The This guy, his name was Pritam Singh. He's not actually Sikh. He's actually an American. Just changed his name. But he looked at me in front of the board and he said, "You're a fucking employee. You do what you're told." And that's when I said, "Uh." So I left and I resigned from it. But I was still part of Sea Shepherd Global, so I figured, okay, we'll just carry on with Global. We don't need the United States. But he then threatened the global directors. And then without a meeting, without a discussion, without a vote, I received an email saying, "You're dismissed from the global board." And then Lamia Salam, the president of Sea Shepherd France, she was the only one to defend me. She began to ask questions. She receives an email, "You're dismissed from the global board." So, and now the global board is suing Sea Shepherd France for over the rights to use the name and the logo. And I'm being sued by this guy, Pritam Singh, for trademark violations when in fact I haven't actually used the name or the logo since leaving Sea Shepherd. I just decided I'm not going to fight this. I'll just start up and do it again. Why am I being sued? Because, well, first of all, we're going to win. It's not a problem, but it's going to cost $1.5 million in legal fees to do it. So he said to me at the time, "If you oppose me, I will use an army of lawyers to destroy you and bury you forever." And so that's what he's trying to do. So I'm trying to fight that. But my main concern really is that we're going to build up. I set up the Captain Paul Watson Foundation. The reason I called it that, it's because can they really? Nobody's going to really take my name away from me, or so. That's not true. They actually took McDonald's family name away from them, but I set that up for that reason. And we got our first ship thanks to one of my longtime friends, John Paul DeJoria. And we did our first two campaigns this summer. We're about to go do a super trawler campaign in October. We've got a crew down on the island of Mayotte between Madagascar and Mozambique protecting sea turtles from poachers. So we're building this up again. So it's like, building up the Navy once again. And we've accomplished an awful lot in the last year. We've done this in 1 year. And our only obstacle are the lawsuits that are being brought against us by Sea Shepherd Global and Sea Shepherd USA. But see, of course, they're gambling on the fact that people will just forget about this, and most people are just too busy to even know anything about it. So when people become aware of it, I'm getting their support. But I'm not by law, I'm not allowed to say contact anybody and say, "Oh, will you support me?" So they have to hear about it and come to me and that. So you're actually right. They buy up everybody's rights. I mean, and then control other people's creations and that. So the people controlling Sea Shepherd today on the global directors are people that I've known and I thought I trusted, but they were co-opted by these trademark violations.
Hmm. Amazing. What are your goals for the Paul Watson Foundation in terms of where you see going in the coming years?
To continue doing what I've been doing for the last 50 years. That's no difference here. My approach has always been aggressive nonviolence, to be controversial, to be confrontational. That's, the film Watson, which was made, the documentary about me, that's exactly what it portrays, that sort of approach. In 2010, I was actually invited by the FBI to give a lecture at the FBI headquarters in Quantico. And they paid me to come give a lecture for it. And, at the end of the lecture, they actually had to agree with a lot of things I was saying, because I said, we're against illegal activities. We're intervening against illegal activities. And the only reason we're vigilantes is because there is no policing force out on the world's oceans and that. But we'd gladly step aside if there is. And at the end of it, one of the FBI agents says, well, you guys are walking a pretty thin line when it comes to the law. And I said, yeah, but does it matter how thin the line is as long as you don't actually cross that line? And I don't think we cross that line. We operate within the boundaries of the law, international law, and of practicality. And he said, yeah, well, you're training eco-terrorists. I said, like who? And he said, well, what about Ron Coronado? You know, he's an eco-terrorist. I said, oh, your definition of an eco-terrorist is a man who released some mink from a mink farm? I said, is that all you're concerned about? And I said, besides, anyway, Rod didn't do that until 5 years after he left Sea Shepherd. So, you know, it's not my responsibility. He said, you trained him. You're responsible. I said, oh, yeah, well, I got four names for you: Timothy McVeigh, Lee Harvey Oswald, and Osama bin Laden. You trained them.
Touche. That's amazing. You know, so much in the ocean is about making the invisible visible. And it seems like much of your work has really brought to light, you know, a lot of the practices that are hidden over the horizon and not really discussed. That seems like a really key, essential aspect. Do you have a sense for how do we make the collapsing ecosystems more visible, in the sense that, you know, I just learned that Florida's waters exceeded 101 Fahrenheit and many of the corals simply died. And yet so much of these ecosystem collapses and deaths seem to go unobserved and unnoticed.
Well, I think it's because people have an overwhelming sense of helplessness. You know, what do we do? The problem is an impossible one to solve. And how do you address an impossible problem? You have to find the impossible solution. And how do you find the impossible solution? Through individual passion, courage, imagination, and resolve. The impossible can become possible. 1972, the very idea that Nelson Mandela would be president of South Africa was unthinkable and therefore impossible. The impossible became possible. So I believe in finding the impossible solutions. And that approach can come, you know, ecosystems, the strength of an ecosystem depends upon diversity and interdependence. So the strength of a movement has to depend on diversity and interdependence. So it doesn't matter how you approach things, whether it be through education, litigation, legislation, or direct intervention, it all works towards the same end. We all have to use our individual skills and our talents to change the world. And we can do it. Because of Diane Fossey, we still have mountain gorillas in Rwanda. Because of David Wingate, we still have the Bermuda storm petrel in Bermuda. Look what Greta Thunberg has been able to accomplish. So I believe that the power really is in the individuals making a difference. We can't depend upon governments, because governments are co-opted, governments are owned. And even when a person with the best intentions gets involved, I think they take them into a back room and beat reality into them or something. Like in 2015, Justin Trudeau was the darling of the environmental conference. He was going to do this, he was going to do that, he was going to do all this. He goes back to Canada, he's pro tar sands, pro oil tankers, pro pipelines, all the promises he made to the indigenous community, he broke. He's become probably one of the worst. And yet he had all of these, everybody had all these great ideals of what he was going to do. But how do you run a country that is dependent upon oil and gas and uranium and all of these things like that, unless you do what your corporations tell you to do, because otherwise you'll be out on your ass. And that's so. I remember Joe Clark, Prime Minister of Canada in early 1980s. He said, we've got to make the price of a gallon of gas reflect what it really costs. And 6 months later, he was no longer Prime Minister.
Yeah, this notion of paying to polluting is something that, you know, paying to pollute is something that occurred during the acid rain, you know, events and the objectives to reduce the ozone holes and whatnot. And it seemed to work there, and yet there seems to be so much resistance to addressing carbon pollution in our atmosphere. Do you have a sense for how that would evolve over time?
Well, it is frustrating. I remember back in the Love Canal days, you know, when children were dying because of pollution at Love Canal in New York State, and they were interviewing this one woman. She said, "Well, aren't you concerned for your children's safety, for their health?" And she says, "Well, if you can't see it, you can't hear it, you can't touch it, it ain't real." And I think that's pretty much people's attitude towards the problem. They don't see it, they don't hear it, they can't touch it, they don't, but they do. And when they do, it's too late. And that's the problem.
Yeah, I hope we're still connected.
Because I think that anthropocentrism. Oh, did I lose you for a second there?
We're back. Yeah, I can hear you again.
I set up my own church called the Church of Biocentrism and Interdependence, because I think that the biggest problem is our anthropocentric cultures, this idea that everything was created for us, that we're in control of everything, we're more important than everything else. And indigenous cultures, for the most part, have a biocentric understanding that we're part of nature, we're part of everything, we're interdependent with everything. I got a call from a reporter from the Fox Network, Brett Hume, and he said, "Did you say at a lecture that bees, trees, worms, and whales are more important than people?" And I said, "Yeah, I said that." He said, "How can you say something so outrageous?" I said, "Well, because they're more important than people. That's the reality of it. I mean, they can live here without us, but we can't live here without them. Try living in a world without bees, trees, and worms. They're more important than we are." And he said, "Well, that's just outrageous." And, very anti-Christian. I says, "Of course it's anti-Christian. It's an anthropocentric religion. All religions are anthropocentric. All religions say we're the center of everything. And all the religions are wrong because of that. We need a new paradigm, a new understanding that we, in fact, are part of everything. We're not dominant over everything." And I like to equate it to the planet being a spaceship. This is this incredible spaceship on this amazing voyage around the Milky Way galaxy. It takes 250 million years to just make one orbit of the galaxy. And that spaceship is operated and run by engineers. And those engineers support the life support system, which provides us with the air we breathe, the food we eat, and regulates climate and temperature. And we humans, we're not engineers. We're passengers. We're having a wonderful time amusing ourselves. But what we're doing is we're murdering the engineers. We're killing them off. And there's only so many engineers that you can destroy before the machinery begins to fall apart. The bees, the trees, the worms, these are the engineers of the planet. And we're just the passengers. And somebody asked me, "Well, then what good are people?" I said, "Well, we do have a use. If at some time, because of our technological abilities, the planet is ever threatened by an asteroid, we may have the ability to actually protect the planet." I think that is our ultimate, our ultimate importance in that way. But again, we also think that we're the more intelligent species on the planet. And that's only because we define what intelligence is. I was doing a debate with a whaler in Norway, and he says, "Watson, you say that whales are more intelligent than people. How can you say something so stupid?" And I said, "Well, I equate intelligence to the ability to live in harmony with the natural world. And by that criteria, we're more intelligent than whales are more intelligent than people." And he said, "Well, by that criteria, cockroaches are more intelligent than people." I said, "George, you're beginning to understand what I'm trying to tell you."
That's wonderful. You're reminding me, the Southern Ocean pre-industrially might have had 500 times as many whales as we have today. And I just wonder, what would that Southern Ocean have been like with 500 times as many whales?
There would have been more phytoplankton, there'd be more zooplankton, there'd be more fishes, of course, and that. And the world would be a better place. Whales are the farmers of the ocean. They provide nutrients to fertilize the crops of phytoplankton, and they're extremely important in that sense. And also, when it comes to intelligence, the human brain is about 1,700 cubic centimeters. The orca brain is 6,000 cubic centimeters. The sperm whale brain, the largest brain to have ever evolved, is 9,000 cubic centimeters. And the convolutions on the neocortex area of both the orcas and sperm whales are far, far more pronounced. And they have 4 lobes to the brain instead of our 3. And so by that criteria, they're far more intelligent in many ways. But their intelligence is all communications, and they don't need to have a car. They don't need to have telephones. We equate intelligence with technology and with hand-to-eye coordination. If a blob of protoplasm stepped out of a spaceship and has a ray gun in its hand, automatically that's an intelligent creature because it's got technology. So that's our criteria for what intelligence is. But a dog can walk into the room and tell you who was there yesterday. So every species has its own intelligence, which is relevant to the ecosystem that it lives in. And we have not been that successful. There's 700,000 species of beetles and ants and things like this. We're the last surviving hominid. And and in recent times, I mean, we only allow Neanderthals 30,000 years ago, and others within the last couple of 100,000 years. We haven't been that successful as a species, and unless we learn to live in harmony with the natural world, we're not going to exist. Although there is one thing that might happen is that we might replace ourselves with robots and artificial intelligence. That's always a possibility. But we as a biological entity, we're not going to exist if we carry on in this way. Only an AI robot will be able to exist in a world that's been depleted of all the resources that we've taken away from it.
I've heard that sharks have a history of nearly 380 million years. I'm living here in Queensland, Australia, next to the lungfish, which also seems to have a history of over 300 million years as well. And it's amazing to go freediving with these lungfish because they've got, four little legs and they live near the bottom, and occasionally they crawl out and they gulp air. It's just amazing to see the hundreds of millions of years of evolution. I've heard that, I mean, the dinosaurs, of course, were successful for a period of 150 million years. And we look at hominids with less than 1 million years of history and about to destroy themselves. And it's like, well, it's like, what is the evolution of our civilization? How do we actually get out of this well?
Yeah, well, we only exist because dinosaurs were exterminated by an asteroid. Otherwise, we would never have evolved to be what we are. Another way, I just wrote an article on it, is that we're actually the children of flowers, because flowering plants developed 200 million years ago as a way to seduce and use animals to procreate. So animals really became a tool in their procreation. And, by developing the flowers they give you a gift, they give you fruits, they give you a nectar, and in return, you can handle our sex life for us. That kind of manipulated the animal world. And they've also manipulated us today through agriculture. We might think we control agriculture, but those plants that developed, like wheat and corns and different things like that, they're probably the most prolific plants on the planet because, we helped them to become what they were. But now, of course, a lot of that's being sabotaged by companies like Monsanto and trying to develop seeds that can't reproduce, which is just insane. I was on the Bill Maher show one time, and they asked me, said, "People call you an eco-terrorist. What's your response?" I said, "I've never worked for Monsanto."
That's a great example. I've heard the biomass of humanity and livestock greatly exceeds that of wildlife. In fact, 70% of the birds on the planet are chickens.
That's true. Very true.
I was just astonished. And so because our built, domestic livestock and all the rest has so greatly exceeded the biomass of wildlife, well, how can we sustain these ecosystems? I just wonder,
Well, I don't think we can. I don't think we can. Last week we had this devastating fire which destroyed the historic city of Lahaina. And why did this happen? It's a combination of dying grasses and high winds. But Hawaii's got one of the highest extinction rates on the planet. Of 141 species of birds, 94 of them became extinct. And the introduction of rats and mongoose and others and things like that, plus the introduction of plants which were not native to the place, has caused this situation where these plants are coming dried out because of drought through climate change. And Lahaina was predictable. And in fact, there were studies showing that wildfires in Hawaii could have a devastating effect, but they were pretty much ignored. And that seems to be the case everywhere. So they're just in this last summer alone, aside from Lahaina and possibly killing 100 or even more people, we've had, 7 people killed in the Greek fires on Rhodos and other islands. We've had 40 people killed in the fires in Algeria, in Spain and Portugal. So this is becoming more and more of a norm. And, and where I live, or I just moved, but where I lived in Vermont, I always thought was one of the safest places to be. And then we just seen these devastating floods in places where nobody ever expected to see floods before. So this is becoming more and more of a problem. And I think hopefully that kind of a kick in the ass from Mother Nature might enlighten people to understand and to get involved and to address the issues. But again, there's this overwhelming feeling of helplessness. What can we do? And I like to encourage people to understand that they do have power. One of the most important things that I ever learned was during 1973, the occupation of Wounded Knee in South Dakota by the American Indian Movement. And I volunteered to be a medic for the American Indian Movement. And while I was there, we were being shot at by 3,000 federal agents. They killed 2 people, they wounded 46. And I went to Russell Means, who was the leader of the American Indian Movement. I said, look, we don't have any hope of winning here. We're overwhelmed. The odds against us are just overwhelming. We can't win. So what are we doing here? And he said something that stayed with me. He said, well, we're not here because we're concerned about the odds against us. And we're not even here because we're concerned about winning or losing. We're here because this is the right place to be, the right thing to do, and the right time to do it. And that's what has stayed with me. So I look at it this way. We have no power in the past. That's gone. No use regretting it. We have no power in the future. Our power rests completely in the present, and what we do in the present will defend what the future will be. So that's where we have to apply ourselves. Let's not get pessimistic about the future. Let's not get depressed about the possibilities. Let's just focus on what can we do right now that's going to make a difference. And that can be anything from focusing on a particular ecosystem, focusing on a particular species, and devoting your life to making sure that species or ecosystem survives. And we've seen the examples of that. And that to me gives me a lot of encouragement that the human species can find a solution to these problems.
Mhm. Yeah, our own climate foundation was named after Asimov's foundation trilogy as well, and that really articulates the collapse of galactic civilization and its rebirth. Do you have hope for a future, and how do we get reborn as a civilization?
Well, following on what I said, no, I don't have hope, but I don't not have hope. All I can do is focus on the present, and hopefully, well, again, hopefully, that will make a difference. But dwelling on the word hope, I think is just doesn't go anywhere.
It's about acting in the present, if I understand correctly. Yeah. Well, you've highlighted how parenting is one of the most important jobs that we could possibly have. It's a challenge to consider trying to building a healthy climate for our children. Well, I suppose you've met, Greta Thunberg is an example of setting individual examples, and certainly your life and actions have set individual examples. What message would you want to convey to young people around the world in terms of their opportunity and any advice you might provide to them regarding how to address the difficult years that we're facing now?
I think that my best advice to young people is to not let people deter you, and not to say, you can't do this. You can do whatever set your mind to do, and you have to believe that in yourself. I mean, all my life I've been told by people, you can't do this, you can't do this, you're going to fail if you do that, and I just couldn't really care less. I think it's called, you have to be able to do something knowing that it may not work, that you're going to fail, and you have to not mind if you fail. You just have to follow your passion and do what's right there. And what you do is you find out, what am I good at? Am I an artist? Am I a teacher? Whatever, and then focus in that area as best you can. And that I think is what's really makes a difference, if people can do that. But I have three children. One's 42, and she has two children, and I have two boys. One is 6, and one is 2, just turned 2. And people say, well, if you're an environmentalist, how can you have children? And I said, well, that's the problem, is that everybody thinks the solution is to not having children. But the problem is that 90% of the people who have children don't give them what they need: love, encouragement, education. That's the problem in the world, is uneducated, undernourished, unloved children. And that, so it doesn't matter how many children you have, it's how you raise them. And what I do with my children is to instill in them this idea that they can do anything. When my daughter was 7 years old, I said, I'm not your boss, Annie. I'm just here to guide you the best I can, but you're in charge of you. Your destiny is yours. And that gave her the confidence, I think, to do what she's done. And, she's actually a producer of video games like Halo and things like this. But that's what her passion lies. But she uses that to help on environmental issues as much as she can, and also she makes a great deal of money, which she actually puts into, to various causes. But I remember when she first went in to get the job, her husband said, well, Lenny, you don't have the experience. You don't have this, you just haven't been around long enough to get this job. And she said, well, all they can do is say no. And she got the job. So that's what I like to instill in people, is that just go and say you want to do this. Do what you think you can do, and don't let anybody tell you you can't do it. And that is probably the best guide I think I can give to children.
That's wonderful. The creator of a film called The Biggest Little Farm was once asked, I think at the premiere, what gives him hope for the world? And he responded that the collective consciousness of individuals that are determined to make a difference, he felt was the greatest restoring force on the planet. How do you see us using this kind of restoring force to transform the way our civilization works and help to build a healthy climate for our children?
Well, the encouraging thing is that there are many, many people today who are doing exactly that, applying themselves to making a difference. I think much more than there was in the past. And also, I think that they don't have much choice, because younger people can see where this is heading. And, they're doing this out of self-survival, really. I mean, I could pretty much say when I was living in the 60s, well, I could pretty much have a good idea what the world was going to be like when I grew up, but I don't think the children can actually see that today. We have no idea what the world at 2050 is going to be. You know, climate change, extinction of species. I mean, we've never faced the kind of situations as a species that we're facing now. This is the sixth mass extinction, which means that we'll lose more plants and animals in 65 years than we've lost in the last 65 million years. And it's unprecedented for our species to go through that. So there's a lot of adaptation and a lot of imagination has to be applied in order to survive in that case. But really, the reality is the young people today are facing incredible consequences tomorrow that they have to find a way to deal with, or else they're just simply not going to survive.
Well, Paul, I must say that your life is an amazingly courageous example of both individual and collective action. Thank you for sharing your story and your time with me today, the trajectory of your life and the way that you brought so much awareness to our wildlife and our natural environment.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Paul. It's a real pleasure talking with you. Any topics that you feel we should touch on further?
Oh, no, I think we covered pretty much everything.
I must say it's a real honor. You know, you've led such a courageous approach. It's incredible to hear the narratives of your life over the past half century and how they've really been steadily focused on really reconnecting humanity with nature in so many ways and getting beyond the historic traditions that sometimes bring enormous amounts of cruelty to our natural world. So thank you for your inspiration. It's
Marley Mowat once said in a very positive way, but he said the problem with Watson is he never grew up, and he said, and that's a good thing.
Well, that's great. That sounds like a real compliment. So that's great. When does your book come out? Is it later this month?
It'll be coming out this month. In fact, it's available on my shop, online. I think it's available on Amazon already.
Wonderful. Well, I look forward to finishing reading it, and I've enjoyed half of it so far. And anyway, I'm looking forward to staying in touch. You're the first organization that I know of. Your earlier one that was inspired after some of the science fiction stories of Asimov, who is one of my favorite writers. And anyway, it's great to connect on this front, and we're hoping to regenerate some kelp forests and seaweed and production, starting in the tropics and subtropics with the Climate Foundation and marine permaculture.
Well, that's really what it's all about, devoting yourself to protecting an ecosystem.
Definitely. My father was an oceanographer, so we're all about focusing, we are focusing on food security, on ecosystem regeneration, and we do want to measure the carbon removals that these nature-based ecosystems can do on the way to regenerating a healthy climate.
Well, if you ever get a chance, another science fiction book, John Brunner's The Sheep Look Up. It was written in 1972, and it actually predicts everything that's happening today.
Amazing. Well, that's incredible. I'm looking forward to reading that one, and I'm reminded a little bit of Ministry for the Future, which Neil Stephenson, I guess. And if I have that right. Anyway, no, I think that's wrong. It's another author. But yeah, I'm getting back into science fiction. I read it enormously. I devoured science fiction as a teenager. And, I think it's an important way to think about the futures that we can bring. And to quote Professor Harari, we can read history and we can't change history, but we can learn from it. And we have a choice as to where we're going to take our future. We do not have to do the same thing as history. We're not condemned to the same fate as history. We can choose to make a difference today.
Well, the problem really is that most people don't even know history.
That is true. Yeah, if those who do not recollect history are condemned to repeat it, perhaps.
Yeah.
That's an amazing challenge. Well, Paul, it's a real honor to meet you. Thank you so much for spending this time, and I look forward to staying in touch on these critically important events and building, let's say, a mycelial network of bridges across the world that hopefully can regenerate healthy climate and healthy ecosystems in our lifetime.
Oh, thank you.